There's a kind of defiance that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't storm the gates or swing a sword. It sits in a dim room with a pen and a candle and writes what no man is allowed to say. Voltaire knew this silence. He lived inside it. Not the silence of fear, but the silence before lightning strikes. The world told him what to believe, what to worship, what to bow before. And he smiled, dipped his quill, and whispered back, "Prove it." They burned his books. They exiled him. They tried to erase his name. But you can't kill a question once it's been asked. And the question he left behind still hums in the dark. What if everything you were taught to revere is just a costume worn by power? What if the gods you fear are only shadows cast by men? Tonight, we step into that old study. We sit beside him in the flicker, and we listen to the truths he was punished for speaking, not because they were lies, but because they were unbearable. First exploration: what happens to the man who refuses to kneel? Voltaire never prayed like other men. He didn't bow his head in churches. He didn't tremble before altars. And that terrified them, because a man who doesn't kneel is a man who can't be controlled. They need you bent. They need you asking permission. They need you to believe that someone else holds the key to your worth, your salvation, your right to speak. Voltaire walked into that machinery and said no, not with rage, not with fire, with laughter, sharp, cutting, impossible to ignore. He mocked the priests who sold heaven like merchants. He ridiculed kings who claimed their thrones were blessed by God, and when they threatened him, he didn't flinch. He wrote faster. Imagine what that costs. Not just exile, or poverty, or danger, though he knew all three, but the deeper cost, the weight of standing alone. Most men bend not because they're weak, but because bending is easier than the silence that follows defiance. You stop being invited. You stop being understood. You become the uncomfortable presence at the table, the one who asks the question no one wants answered. Voltaire lived there, in that cold, clear air where certainty dissolves and every belief must defend itself. He didn't do it to be cruel. He did it because he loved truth more than comfort. And truth, he knew, is almost always inconvenient. There's a scene that haunts me. Voltaire, old now, white-haired, bent from decades of exile and argument, sitting in a theater in Paris. The crowd sees him. They rise. They applaud. Not because he gave them easy answers, but because he refused to let them sleep. He woke them up. He reminded them that their minds were their own, that no king, no pope, no holy text could do their thinking for them. And in that moment, surrounded by the very city that once wanted him dead, he smiled, not with triumph, with relief, because he had survived the one thing most men never face, the fear of thinking for themselves. You don't have to be Voltaire. You don't have to mock gods or provoke empires. But the question remains, what are you kneeling for? Not out of love, not out of choice, but out of fear. Fear of judgment, fear of exile, fear of being wrong. Voltaire would tell you that fear is the collar they slip around your neck. And the moment you stop kneeling, the moment you stand and ask why, that's when you become dangerous. Not to the world, to the lie. And the lie, he learned, will fight harder to survive than any truth ever will. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. The silence of a man who laughed at death itself. Second exploration. Why did Voltaire smile at the edge of the grave? They came to his deathbed with crosses and prayers. The priests arrived like vultures, circling, waiting for him to break, waiting for the great mocker to beg forgiveness, to renounce his life's work, to admit he was wrong. And Voltaire, fading, barely able to speak, looked up at them and said something that still echoes. "Let me die in peace." No confession, no plea, no last-minute conversion, just a quiet refusal. A man who faced the void the same way he faced kings, unimpressed. Most of us fear death because we fear we've lived wrong. We fear judgment. We fear the story we told ourselves might not hold. But Voltaire feared none of that. He didn't believe in divine punishment. He didn't believe in eternal hellfire. He believed that life was here, now, brief and blazing, and that the only judgment that mattered was the one you passed on yourself. Did you think freely? Did you love fiercely? Did you refuse to be someone's puppet? If yes, then death was just the final curtain, nothing to apologize for. There's a deep, strange courage in that. To live as if this is all there is. To build meaning not from fear of what comes after, but from love of what's here now. Voltaire wrote until his hands shook. He fought until his voice cracked. He laughed until the very end, not because life was easy, but because laughter was his rebellion. The world wanted him solemn, repentant, broken. He gave them wit. He gave them fire. He gave them a mirror they couldn't look away from. And when the end came, he didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He let go. Not with resignation, but with something stranger. Satisfaction. He had lived exactly as he chose. He had spoken every truth that burned inside him. He had defied gods and kings and walked away smiling. What more could a man ask for? The priests left disappointed. The church refused him burial in consecrated ground. They tried to erase him, even in death. But his words survived. His laughter survived. And the question he left behind still lives in anyone who dares to ask it. What if the only heaven worth seeking is the one you build with your own hands? Before we step away from his grave, there's one last truth he whispered into the dark, a truth about freedom that most men never learn. Third exploration. What does it cost to think for yourself? Voltaire spent most of his life in exile, not because he was violent, not because he stole or murdered, but because he thought. And worse, he wrote what he thought. In his time, that was the unforgivable sin. To question the king was treason. To question the church was heresy. To question both was suicide. And Voltaire did all three, calmly, relentlessly, with a pen sharper than any blade. They hunted him. They banned his books. They tried to silence him with laws, with threats, with exile. And every time they pushed him out, he wrote more, louder, sharper, because he understood something most men never grasp. Freedom isn't given, it's taken, and the price is everything. Think about what he gave up: comfort, safety, the warmth of belonging. He could have stayed quiet. He could have written safe, forgettable things. He could have kept his thoughts to himself and lived in peace. But he couldn't. Because once you see the lie, you can't unsee it. Once you taste real freedom, the freedom to think, to question, to refuse, everything else feels like a cage. And Voltaire chose the wilderness over the cage, every single time. But here's the part no one tells you. That wilderness is cold, it's lonely, it's filled with doubt. Because when you think for yourself, you lose the comfort of certainty. You lose the tribe. You lose the easy answers. You stand in the wind with nothing but your own mind, and that mind becomes both your salvation and your torment. Voltaire knew this. He lived it. He wrestled with it in every letter, every essay, every sleepless night, and still, he chose it. Because he understood that a life lived in borrowed thoughts is no life at all. It's a performance, a costume, a slow, quiet death. The cost of thinking for yourself is high, but the cost of not thinking, that's higher. You become an echo, a shadow, a voice repeating someone else's script. And when you die, nothing of you remains. No spark, no fire, no question left unanswered. Voltaire refused that fate. He burned too bright. He asked too much. He loved truth too fiercely. And when the world tried to snuff him out, he became smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to kill, drifting into every corner, every mind, every quiet moment when a person dares to ask, what if I stopped believing what I was told and started believing what I know? That's his gift. Not answers. Questions. The kind that don't let you sleep. The kind that remake you. The kind that, once asked, can never be unasked. And maybe that's what freedom really is. Not the absence of chains, but the presence of a question that's entirely your own. Fourth exploration. Can a man who owns nothing still terrify a throne? There's a particular kind of power that lives outside the reach of armies. It doesn't wear armor. It doesn't gather in palaces. It exists in the quiet scratch of a quill across paper. In the smirk that flickers across a face when someone speaks a truth no one else dares whisper aloud. Voltaire understood this power better than most men who ever lived. He wielded it like a blade made of moonlight, invisible from certain angles, blinding in others. Picture him for a moment. An aging man with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, sitting in a drafty study somewhere on the edge of France. The candles are low. His fingers are ink-stained. Outside, the world trembles under the weight of kings and bishops, men who command nations with a gesture, who can sign a name and end a life. And yet, in that small room, with nothing but words and wit, Voltaire made them afraid. Not because he had soldiers, not because he had gold, but because he had something they could never control, the ability to make people laugh at them. Laughter, you see, is a strange kind of rebellion. It doesn't storm the gates. It doesn't shout in the streets. It slips under the door like smoke, curling around the edges of authority, making it look smaller, more absurd. When you laugh at a king, you stop seeing a god. You start seeing a man in an expensive hat, and once that illusion cracks, it can never fully repair itself. Voltaire knew this instinctively. He watched the church condemn men to death for reading the wrong book, for asking the wrong question. He saw monarchs parade through cities while children starved in the mud. And instead of raging, instead of despairing, he wrote, he mocked. He turned their grand pronouncements into punchlines, their sacred certainties into comedies so sharp they drew blood, and they hated him for it. They banned his books. They exiled him. They burned his words in public squares as if fire could erase an idea. But here's the thing about ideas. They don't need a body to survive. They travel in whispers. They hide in the margins of other books. They live in the minds of people who've heard just enough to want more. You can kill a man. You can't kill a question. Voltaire spent his life planting questions in places they didn't belong. In the courts of kings, in the chambers of bishops, in the comfortable certainties of people who'd never thought to ask why things were the way they were. And those questions grew like weeds through marble, cracking foundations that seemed eternal. There's something deeply intimate about this kind of power. It doesn't require wealth or nobility. It doesn't demand physical strength or youth. It only asks that you pay attention, that you notice the gap between what people say and what they do, that you find the courage to point at that gap and say, quietly or loudly, I see it. Most men go their whole lives without ever claiming that power. They bow when they're told to bow. They repeat what they're told to repeat, not because they're weak, but because it's easier, because questioning takes energy, because mockery makes you enemies, because standing outside the circle of shared belief is cold and lonely, and no one gives you a medal for it. But Voltaire chose that cold. He chose that loneliness. And in doing so, he discovered something the powerful had always known and always feared, that their authority was more fragile than they wanted anyone to realize, that it rested not on strength, but on agreement, on people choosing every day to pretend the emperor's clothes were real. He stopped pretending. And in that act, he became dangerous. Not dangerous in the way a sword is dangerous. Dangerous in the way a mirror is dangerous. Dangerous because he reflected back what people didn't want to see about themselves, about their leaders, about the stories they'd been told since childhood. And the remarkable thing, the thing that still echoes across the centuries, is that he did this with nothing but language. Words arranged in the right order, delivered with the right tone, can do what armies cannot. They can change how a person sees the world. They can make the unmovable seem absurd. They can plant a seed of doubt that grows in the dark, silent and unstoppable. So here's the question that sits beneath all of this, the one Voltaire lived and breathed. Can a man who owns nothing still terrify a throne? The answer clearly is yes. But the deeper truth is this, that power, the power of words and mockery and uncomfortable questions, doesn't belong to special people. It's not reserved for geniuses or heroes. It's available to anyone willing to see clearly and speak honestly, anyone willing to trade comfort for truth. Voltaire didn't have an army. He had a pen. And with it, he shook the world. But there's another side to this mockery, another room in the same house where the laughter fades and something quieter waits. Fifth exploration. What if doubt is the only honest prayer? There's a stillness that arrives when you stop pretending to know, a kind of quiet that settles in the chest when you finally admit, if only to yourself, that most of what you were taught might be wrong, or incomplete, or shaped by someone else's fear, someone else's need for control. Voltaire lived in that stillness, not because he rejected everything, but because he refused to accept anything without looking at it first, turning it over in his hands, checking for cracks. Faith, in his time, wasn't gentle. It was sharp-edged and absolute, enforced by men who claimed to speak for God, but sounded more like landlords protecting property. Question the doctrine, and you weren't just wrong. You were damned, dangerous, worthy of fire, literal or social. And yet Voltaire questioned anyway, not with the blunt arrogance of someone who thinks they have all the answers, but with the careful curiosity of someone who suspects no one does. This is where most people misunderstand him. They think he was simply against religion, against God. But that's too simple. What he was against was certainty. The kind of certainty that stops asking questions. The kind that builds walls instead of bridges. That burns books instead of reading them. He saw what certainty did to people, how it hardened them, how it made them cruel in the name of righteousness, how it allowed a man to torture another and sleep soundly afterward, convinced he was serving a higher purpose. Doubt, by contrast, is humble. It admits limitation. It says, I might be wrong. And in that admission, there's a kind of grace. Imagine a prayer that begins not with praise or petition, but with, I don't know. A prayer that doesn't ask for answers, but admits the vastness of the question. That's the space Voltaire inhabited. He looked at the universe, at its beauty and brutality, its order and chaos, and he didn't see a simple story. He saw mystery, endless, humbling mystery. And instead of pretending otherwise, instead of wrapping that mystery in comfortable dogma, he let it remain strange. Let it sit there, unresolved. This takes a different kind of courage than faith. Faith asks you to leap. Doubt asks you to stand at the edge and look down, to feel the vertigo and not turn away. Most people can't tolerate that. They need the ground to be solid. They need someone to tell them what's true and what's not, what's sacred and what's profane. They need the world to make sense in a way that fits inside their head. Voltaire didn't have that need. Or maybe he did, and he learned to live without it being met. Either way, he spent his life asking questions that had no easy answers, poking at the comfortable lies people told themselves to get through the day. And the strange thing is, there's peace in that. Not the peace of knowing, but the peace of accepting that you don't. The peace of releasing the burden of certainty, of letting yourself be small in the face of something vast. He wrote once with a kind of weary affection that if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. Not because he believed in divine revelation, but because he saw how desperately people needed meaning, how they couldn't bear the thought of a universe that didn't care, that didn't watch, that didn't judge or reward or punish. But he also saw the danger in that invention. How quickly a God of love becomes a God of rules. How easily mercy turns to cruelty when enforced by men with power and bad incentives. So he walked a line. He didn't dismiss the sacred, but he refused to let anyone claim ownership of it. He didn't mock the search for meaning, but he mocked the hell out of anyone who pretended to have found it completely and was willing to hurt others over it. There's something deeply compassionate about that position, even if it doesn't look like it at first glance. It's the compassion of someone who says, I don't have the answers, and neither do you, so maybe we should stop killing each other over whose story is right. Doubt, in Voltaire's hands, wasn't destruction. It was protection. Protection against fanaticism, against the violence that certainty so often births. And maybe that's the prayer, if we're calling it that. Not a plea for answers, but a commitment to keep asking, to stay open, to resist the seduction of simple stories in a complicated world. Voltaire never stopped asking, never stopped doubting, and in that refusal to settle, he found a kind of freedom that most people never taste. It's the freedom of knowing you don't have to defend a position you're not sure is true. The freedom of changing your mind when new evidence arrives. The freedom of saying, I was wrong, without it shattering your sense of self. That freedom comes at a cost, though. It's lonely. It's uncomfortable. It puts you outside the tribe, outside the circle of shared belief. But it's honest. And for Voltaire, honesty mattered more than belonging. So the question lingers, soft and persistent. What if doubt is the only honest prayer? What if the truest form of reverence is admitting you don't understand and being okay with that? What if the sacred isn't found in certainty, but in the courage to keep seeking, even when you know you'll never fully arrive? Voltaire didn't answer that. He just lived it. And in living it, he gave permission to everyone who came after to do the same. And yet, beneath all that mockery and doubt, there was something else. A choice he made every day, quietly, in the face of everything. Sixth, exploration. Why does a cynic keep planting gardens? There's a paradox at the heart of Voltaire's life that most people miss. Here was a man who spent decades dismantling illusions, who saw through the hypocrisies of church and state, who watched humanity repeat the same brutal mistakes and seemingly learn nothing from them. A man who had every reason to grow bitter, to retreat into misanthropy, to decide that people were hopeless and the world was irredeemable. And yet, at the end of his life, after all the exile and controversy and watching his books burn, he bought a small estate and started farming. He planted gardens, cultivated vegetables, improved the land. He built workshops and gave employment to people who needed it. He wrote letters about agricultural techniques and crop yields, with the same energy he'd once reserved for mocking kings. And in his final great work, Candide, after dragging his characters through every imaginable horror, war, slavery, earthquake, betrayal, he ended not with despair, but with a simple, almost mundane directive. We must cultivate our garden. It's easy to read that as resignation, as if he's saying, the world is terrible, so just tend your little plot and ignore the rest. But that's not it. Not quite. There's something fiercer underneath, something defiant. Because planting a garden is an act of hope. It's a statement that tomorrow matters, that the future exists and is worth preparing for, even if you won't be there to see the full harvest. You plant seeds knowing it will take time, knowing there will be storms and pests and droughts, knowing that most of what you plant won't make it, and you do it anyway. That's not optimism. Optimism is easy and often shallow. This is something harder. It's hope with its eyes open. Hope that has seen the worst and chosen to build something small and good anyway. Voltaire had seen the worst. He'd watched the Lisbon earthquake kill thousands and heard priests declare it God's punishment. He'd seen innocent men executed on false charges. He'd seen the powerful crush the weak without consequence, over and over in every country, under every flag. And still, he planted. There's a kind of rebellion in that, a refusal to let cruelty have the last word, a refusal to let the darkness win by default simply because you stopped trying. But here's the thing. He didn't plant because he believed in some grand narrative of progress, some inevitable march toward justice. He'd lost that illusion long ago. He planted because it was the right thing to do, in that moment, in that place, with the hands and time and land he had. It's a deeply practical philosophy, not utopian, not naive, just grounded, in both senses of the word. He knew he couldn't fix the world. He knew that most of what he wrote would be forgotten or misunderstood, that the institutions he mocked would outlive him, that people would keep making the same mistakes long after he was dust. But he could make his corner of the world slightly better. He could employ people fairly. He could write one more essay pointing out one more injustice. He could plant one more row of beans. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all anyone can ever do. Tend the small patch of earth within their reach, and do it well. Do it kindly. Do it with attention. There's something almost monastic about that. But instead of a monastery, it's a garden. Instead of prayer, it's work. Instead of waiting for salvation, It's making something slightly less broken, right now. The cynics, the real ones, the ones who've given up, they don't plant gardens. They don't write letters. They don't care about crop yields or whether their workers are paid fairly. They've decided it doesn't matter. So why bother? Voltaire bothered, even after everything, especially after everything. And maybe that's the real test of a person. Not what they believe when things are easy, but what they do when they have every excuse to give up, and don't. He'd spent his whole life in intellectual combat, fighting with words and wit and relentless mockery. But in the end, the fight that mattered most was quieter. It was the daily decision to build instead of destroy, to care instead of dismiss, to act as if your actions mattered, even when you couldn't prove they did. There's no grand answer here, no revelation, just the slow, steady work of living decently in an indecent world, of choosing again and again to create something rather than nothing, to leave things slightly better than you found them. Knowing that slightly better is still an achievement when everything pulls toward entropy and despair. Voltaire didn't change the world in his lifetime. The kings stayed on their thrones. The church kept its power. The injustices he fought against continued long after he died. But he changed how people thought. He planted ideas that grew slowly, in darkness, through generations. Ideas about tolerance, about questioning authority, about the dignity of doubt. And those ideas, in time, did reshape the world. He couldn't have known that. He planted them anyway. So maybe that's the answer to the question. A cynic keeps planting gardens because the alternative is surrender, because despair is easy and hope is hard. But hope is the only thing that ever built anything worth having. Because even if the harvest fails, the act of planting matters. It says, I was here, I tried, I cared. And in the end, after all the words and wit and mockery, that might be the most radical thing Voltaire ever did. He cared, despite everything he knew, despite every reason not to. He planted his garden, and the world slowly, impossibly grew a little more green. Seventh exploration. What becomes of the heart that laughs at its own chains? There's a particular kind of laughter that rises from the chest when you've stopped believing in rescue. Not bitter laughter. Not the kind that poisons. Something else. Something Voltaire knew intimately in those long years when his books were burned in public squares, when his name was whispered like a curse in gilded halls, when kings ordered his arrest and priests prayed for his damnation. He laughed, not because he was safe, but because he had discovered something they couldn't take from him. Picture him there, in his study at Ferney, near the Swiss border, just beyond the reach of French law. An old man now, wrapped in a worn velvet robe, ink-stained fingers holding a quill that had toppled emperors with nothing but sentences. The candle flickers. Outside, darkness presses against the windows like an old question. And he's writing again. Always writing. Letters that will travel in secret, tucked inside false book covers, smuggled past authorities who would love nothing more than to silence him forever. But here's what they never understood. The chains they forged for him. Exile, censorship, the constant threat of the Bastille. He had already transformed them into something else entirely. He wore them like loose bracelets, rattling them deliberately, making music from metal meant to bind. You see, most men spend their lives pretending their chains don't exist. They call them duty, tradition, the way things have always been. They polish them until they shine, until they almost look like jewelry. But Voltaire did something stranger. He acknowledged every link, counted them out loud, described their weight and composition with scientific precision. And then, with that peculiar genius of his, he asked the question that changes everything. Who said I had to carry these seriously? There's a night in 1726 you should know about. Voltaire, still young then, still called François-Marie Arouet, has just been beaten by the hired thugs of a nobleman he mocked at the opera. The Chevalier de Rohan, insulted by Voltaire's wit, had him thrashed like a dog in the street, while Parisian society watched and did nothing. Because that's what happened to commoners who forgot their place. That's how chains worked. Voltaire challenged Rohan to a duel. Rohan's family had him thrown into the Bastille instead. No trial, no charges. Just a letter signed by the king, a lettre de cachet, and a cell. Pure aristocratic power, arbitrary as lightning, crushing as gravity. He stayed there 11 days before they offered him a choice, permanent imprisonment or exile to England. He chose England, and in that choice, in those 11 days of darkness, something crystallized inside him that would never soften again. Not hatred. That would have been simpler. What formed was something more dangerous. Absolute clarity about the nature of the game, and an unshakable decision never to play by their rules again. In England, he discovered Newton, Locke, a society that argued openly about ideas that would get you killed in France. He learned their language, absorbed their philosophy, and when he returned to France years later, he brought something back that terrified the authorities more than any weapon. He brought perspective, the ability to stand outside the system and see it for what it was. Theater, costume, convention pretending to be divine law, and so he laughed. But listen carefully to the quality of that laughter. It wasn't escape, it was recognition. The laugh of a man who sees the puppeteer's strings, who understands that the emperor's crown is heavy but removable, that the sacred is often just the old, and the forbidden is frequently just the true. His heart didn't harden. That's what's strange. You'd expect bitterness, cynicism in the corrosive sense, a turning away from life. Instead, he became more alive. He planted gardens at Ferney, literal gardens, vegetables, flowers, useful, beautiful things growing in soil. He took in refugees, people fleeing religious persecution. He adopted a young woman, educated her, treated her like a daughter. He fought legal battles for the wrongly executed, spending his own money, his diminishing energy, his famous name, on people who could never repay him. The chains didn't disappear. France still banned his books. The church still condemned him. Kings still wanted him silent. But somewhere in that laughter, in that recognition of absurdity, he found a kind of freedom that doesn't require permission. The freedom of seeing clearly, of refusing to pretend, of saying the true thing even when the true thing is dangerous. There's a letter he wrote late in life where he describes himself as happy, actually happy, living in exile, body failing, reputation destroyed in official circles, unable to return to Paris except in secret, and yet happy, surrounded by people he loved, doing work he believed in, saying what he thought needed saying. The chains were still there. He just wasn't carrying them anymore. He was dancing with them, making them sing. What becomes of the heart that laughs at its own chains? It doesn't become stone. It becomes something more subtle, resilient in a way that doesn't require hardness, free in a way that doesn't require escape. It learns to find joy in the space between the bars, to plant seeds in prison yards, to sing songs that guards can't confiscate, because they live in the melody itself, in the act of singing, in the breath that carries them. And late at night, when the candle burns low, when the work is done, and the letters are sealed and sent into the darkness toward destinations uncertain, that heart rests, not in victory, not in safety, but in the strange peace of having been faithful to the laughter, of having refused the easy comfort of delusion, of having chosen sight, even when blindness would have been so much simpler. The chains remain, they always do, but they rattle now to a rhythm of his choosing. And in that rattle, if you listen closely, you can hear something almost like music, almost like freedom, almost like joy. But there's another question worth sitting with, something Voltaire understood from those years watching courtiers bow and scrape. 8th, exploration. Why do some men hunger? Most deeply in palaces, Versailles at twilight, gold leaf catching the last rays of sun, turning walls into molten wealth, mirrors stretching endlessly, multiplying splendor until you can't tell what's real and what's reflection. Servants move silently through corridors, carrying silver trays, keeping the machinery of luxury humming. Everything perfect, everything orchestrated, everything hollow. Voltaire walked these halls, not as a servant, not as a supplicant. Frederick the Great invited him to Prussia. Catherine of Russia sought his correspondence. He dined with kings, slept in palaces, saw up close what most people only imagine from a distance. And he discovered something that haunted him more than any prison ever could: the profound starvation of the overfed. There's a peculiar emptiness that lives in rooms too large, a silence that persists even through music and laughter. Voltaire saw it in the eyes of princes who had never been told no, who had been given everything except permission to be honest. He watched men in ermine and velvet die of a hunger no feast could touch. Not hunger for bread, hunger for something real to push against, something true to hold on to, some conversation that wasn't performance, some moment that wasn't transaction. Think about what it means to live where every word is weighed for advantage, every gesture calculated, every friendship provisional, where authenticity is suicide and masks are mandatory. The rich banquet tables, the gilded chairs, the symphonies playing in ballrooms lit by 1,000 candles. And underneath it all, a desperate poverty of the soul. Voltaire once watched a duke at dinner, a man who owned forests and villages, who commanded armies with a word. And he saw something flicker across the duke's face when someone told a genuine joke. Something unplanned, something that made the table laugh spontaneously. For just a second the duke looked hungry, desperately hungry, not for the pheasant on his plate, but for that moment of unguarded humanity, that flash of something that wasn't about power or position or inheritance. That look stayed with Voltaire. He wrote about it later, carefully, because you couldn't just say these things. But he understood something then about why kings collected philosophers like exotic birds, why they wanted these dangerous men with their dangerous ideas close by. Not to listen to them necessarily, but to feed on something they carried. Some vitality, some connection to life as it was actually lived, not as it was performed in throne rooms. The palace dweller lives in a world where consequences have been removed. Hungry? Food appears. Cold? Fires are already lit. Bored? Entertainment materializes. Every physical need anticipated, met, exceeded, and in that cushioned existence, something essential begins to atrophy. The muscles you use to navigate real resistance, to solve actual problems, to feel genuinely afraid or genuinely joyful, they weaken from disuse. Voltaire noticed that the people most obsessed with power were often the ones least able to experience anything directly. They consumed reports, summaries, filtered versions of reality. The king learns about his kingdom through courtiers with agendas. The wealthy man experiences his wealth through accountants and stewards. Everything mediated, everything managed. A golden prison of comfort so complete, it becomes a kind of sensory deprivation. And so they hunger, not for more gold. They have gold, not for more power. They have power. They hunger for the thing Voltaire had, the thing the poor Swiss refugee sleeping in his barn had, the thing the revolutionary printer working in secret had. Contact with something raw and actual, friction, consequence, the sharp edge of the real. He saw it in Frederick the Great most clearly. Here was a king who genuinely loved philosophy, who wrote poetry, who wanted desperately to be more than his crown. And yet, Frederick could never quite escape the throne, could never stop performing kingship long enough to just be. Their friendship, and it was real, complicated, damaged, but real, ultimately fractured because Frederick couldn't stop being king, even in private letters. And Voltaire couldn't stop being Voltaire, even in royal palaces. There's a story Voltaire tells about walking in Frederick's gardens at Potsdam. Magnificent gardens, of course, designed by masters, maintained by armies of workers, every tree placed for maximum aesthetic effect. Beautiful, utterly beautiful, and utterly dead in some essential way. Nothing wild, nothing unexpected, no corner where nature forgot to be picturesque. Frederick asked him what he thought, and Voltaire, because he was Voltaire and couldn't help himself, said something about preferring the chaos of a real forest to the perfection of a planned one. Frederick smiled, but there was something behind the smile, a flash of that hunger again. Because Frederick knew, somewhere underneath the crown and the philosophy and the military genius, he knew he was living in one of those planned gardens, that his whole life was the aesthetic arrangement. And somewhere beyond the hedges, life was happening with all its mess and danger and genuine feeling. The men in palaces hunger because they've traded experience for control. They've surrounded themselves with certainty, with predictability, with comfort so absolute, it becomes a kind of numbness, and the soul, strange instrument that it is, would rather feel pain than feel nothing, would rather struggle than float, would rather risk than endure another perfectly orchestrated evening where nothing unexpected can possibly happen. Voltaire understood this because he lived in both worlds. He knew poverty, prison, exile, and he knew luxury, court life, the inner chambers of power. And he recognized that the exile had something the king did not. Freedom to feel fully, freedom to respond authentically, freedom to be surprised by sunrise, because it wasn't manufactured for your pleasure. That's why he eventually left the palaces, not in anger, not in protest. He just quietly migrated toward the edges, toward Fernie, toward a place where he could grow vegetables and fight real fights and correspond with people who said what they meant because they had nothing to lose. He chose the hunger that comes from reaching toward something difficult over the starvation that comes from having everything and feeling nothing. And late at night, in his modest room at Ferney, eating simple food, working by candlelight on some treatise that would enrage authorities and save no one and matter deeply, he felt rich in a way the gold rooms never delivered, rich with purpose, rich with consequence, rich with the texture of a life that pushed back, that resisted, that required him to be more than ornamental. The palace dwellers kept writing him letters, kept asking him to return, kept trying to pull him back into their golden nets. And he kept declining, gently, because he understood what they didn't, that hunger is a compass. And when you hunger most deeply in palaces, it means you need to find a smaller door, a quieter room, a place where the bread you break is earned and shared and real. But there's one more thing about mockery and laughter that deserves the darkness to consider. Ninth exploration. What truth hides in the silence after mockery ends? The wit lands, the room erupts, laughter echoes off walls, knowing glances exchanged, the target skewered perfectly, the absurdity exposed with surgical precision. Voltaire delivers his line, the one that will be quoted in salons for weeks, the one that makes him dangerous and famous in equal measure. And then, later, alone, the laughter fades. The audience disperses, the candle burns, and in that silence, something else emerges. This is the moment no one writes about, the moment after the performance, after the clever demolition of some fool's argument or some tyrant's pretension. When the weapon is set down and the warrior becomes just a man again, older every year, tired in ways wit can't remedy. Voltaire spent 60 years throwing lightning at darkness. His barbs against the church are legendary, his mockery of kings, his satire of philosophers who built elaborate systems to justify suffering, his devastating lampoons of people who deserved every word. He was a master of the cutting remark, the perfect phrase that exposes corruption, hypocrisy, or stupidity so completely that laughter becomes the only possible response. But here's what the biographies often miss. Mockery was never the destination for him. It was a tool, a diagnostic instrument, a way of clearing space for something else. And in the silence after the mockery, after the target has been hit and the audience satisfied, that something else waited, quiet, patient, more important than the joke. He mocked Leibniz's optimism, the idea that this is the best of all possible worlds, despite earthquakes swallowing cities and children dying of preventable diseases. Candide destroys that comfortable philosophy with relentless satirical precision. But after the mockery, in the famous last line, something else emerges. We must cultivate our garden. Not a joke, a truth, simple, practical, surprisingly tender. The mockery cleared away the delusion. What followed was instruction on how to live. There's a letter he wrote late in life to a younger writer who had perfectly mimicked his style. The young man had written a cruel, funny piece eviscerating some minor aristocrat. Voltaire read it and wrote back something unexpected. He praised the wit, but warned against mockery as an end in itself. The laughter, he wrote, should be in service of something you would defend with silence if you had to. What does that mean? That every joke worth telling points towards something you actually care about. That mockery without purpose is just cruelty with better vocabulary. That the silence after the laughter matters more than the laughter itself. Because that's where you live. That's where your actual values wait, exposed, vulnerable, no longer protected by humor. Think about his last years, the fights he chose. Not clever verbal duels with other intellectuals, not witty exchanges in salons. Real battles, exhausting and often hopeless. The Calas affair. Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant, tortured and executed on false charges of murdering his son to prevent a conversion to Catholicism. Voltaire took up the case 3 years after the execution, when it was too late to save the man, but not too late to clear his name and help his destroyed family. No jokes here. Or rather, the jokes were present but subordinate. He wrote pamphlets, yes, with flashes of his characteristic wit. But mostly, he wrote petitions, letters to lawyers, appeals to authorities. Tedious work, unglamorous work. The kind of thing that doesn't make you famous or clever, just tired. He spent his own money, his declining energy, his remaining influence on this dead man and his shattered widow and orphaned children. Why? Because in the silence after all his mockery of religious fanaticism, after all his satire of injustice, there was this, a belief that individuals matter, that truth matters, that when the jokes are done, you still have to choose what you'll do with the short time you have. And he chose to fight for people who could never repay him, could barely thank him, who would have been forgotten by history if not for this old man who couldn't let injustice have the last word. The silence after mockery is where you discover what you actually believe. It's easy to be clever. It's harder to be clear. It's easy to demolish someone else's ideas. It's harder to say what you stand for. When you can't hide behind humor, when you have to speak plainly and risk being wrong, or naive, or sincere. Voltaire, the great mocker, built a church at Ferney. Yes, a church, with his own money, inscribed above the door, Deo erexit Voltaire. Voltaire erected this to God, not to Jesus, not to the church, to God, direct, personal, unmediated by hierarchy or dogma. He mocked the church his entire life, and then built a place for the divine he couldn't quite dismiss. The paradox lived comfortably in him because he understood something subtle. You can reject the corruption of an institution and still acknowledge whatever it was meant to serve. In that silence after the laughter, he planted his gardens. Literal gardens, yes, but also metaphorical ones. Ideas about tolerance, about the right to think freely, about the dignity of individuals against the machinery of state and church power. Seeds that wouldn't bloom in his lifetime. Seeds that might not bloom at all. But he planted them anyway, because mockery can clear the ground, but it can't make things grow. That requires different work, quieter work. The kind you do when no one's watching and there's no applause coming. There's a portrait painted of him late in life. You can see the smile, the intelligence still bright in those eyes. But if you look longer, there's something else. A kind of seriousness underneath the wit. The face of someone who has laughed at everything and found in the silence after that certain things remain unlaughable at. Love, maybe. Kindness, the garden. The effort to reduce suffering where you can, the small, persistent attempts to make the world marginally less cruel. He died in Paris in 1778, having finally returned after decades of exile. The church refused him last rites. His body was smuggled out of the city in secret because they wanted to deny him burial. His friends took him to an abbey where a sympathetic abbot allowed the interment before official word could arrive forbidding it. Even in death, he was trouble. Even in death, controversial. But here's the thing. In the years and decades after, in that long silence after his particular laughter ended, what survived? Not the specific jokes mostly, not the clever insults. What survived were the ideas he defended in the quiet moments, the tolerance, the resistance to arbitrary authority, the insistence on evidence and reason, the belief that individuals shouldn't be sacrificed to abstractions. The mockery was the method. The silence after was the message. And in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can hear what he was really saying all along, underneath the jokes, that we're here briefly, that cruelty is real and should be opposed, that systems of power lie, constantly and beautifully, that thinking for yourself is difficult and necessary, that gardens don't plant themselves, that laughter can be a form of courage. But so can the quiet decision to help one person for no good reason, except that they need help and you can give it. And now, as the night deepens and these old stories settle into whatever space they'll occupy in your mind, the question remains, hanging gently in the dark. What lives in your silence? After all your own clever words, your defenses, your performances, what's there? Not what you claim to believe, what you would actually plant, actually defend, actually spend yourself on when the audience is gone and only you remain, alone with your candle, your choices, and your brief, irreplaceable time. The answer doesn't need to come tonight. It's enough to let the question rest beside you, quiet as snow falling, patient as seeds beneath winter ground. 10th exploration. What if freedom was a wound? You chose to keep bleeding. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with seeing clearly. Not the loneliness of being abandoned, but the loneliness of standing in a crowded room and realizing no one else can see what you see. Voltaire knew this loneliness intimately. He carried it like a second spine, straight and unyielding, even when it would have been so much easier to bend. Picture him there, in his study at Ferney, near the Swiss border. An old man now, but his pen still sharp as a surgical blade. The candles burn low. Outside, the world he mocked and loved in equal measure continues its ancient machinery of cruelty and forgetting. He writes another letter, another pamphlet, another assault on the comfortable lies that let men sleep soundly while others suffer. And here's what haunts the quiet spaces between his words. He knows he'll never see the world he's fighting for. He knows the freedom he champions will cost him everything and change almost nothing in his lifetime. But he writes anyway. There's something almost perverse about this, isn't there? To choose a wound and refuse to let it heal. To see injustice and not look away, even when looking away would bring peace. Most men, when they discover the world is broken, learn to live with the brokenness. They build small shelters of routine and comfort. They focus on what they can control. They're not wrong to do this. Survival has its own wisdom. But Voltaire couldn't do it, or wouldn't. The distinction hardly matters. He had tasted something that ruined him for ordinary contentment. The dangerous knowledge that words could cut through the fog of authority. That laughter could puncture the solemnity of power. That one voice, wielded with precision, could make kings and priests uncomfortable in their certainty. Once you know that, once you felt that electricity running through your pen to the page, how do you go back to safe silence? The wound was this. He could see through the theater of power. He could see the puppeteers and their strings. See the script everyone was reading from without questioning. And having seen, he couldn't unsee. Having spoken, he couldn't unlive those words. Every truth he uncovered about corruption in the church, about the cruelty embedded in laws, about the absurdity of men claiming divine mandate for their brutality. Each truth bound him more tightly to his task. Each act of courage made the next act necessary. Each book, each satire, each letter defending some stranger wrongly imprisoned or executed, Each became another thread in a web he was weaving around himself. And here's what they don't tell you about speaking truth. It never feels like victory. It feels like bleeding. It feels like walking away from the warm fire where everyone else is gathered, telling comfortable stories. It feels like watching your friends make peace with systems you cannot accept, watching them grow tired of your intensity, your refusal to let things rest. Voltaire lost fortunes, lost favor, spent years in exile, watched his books burned in public squares. He was beaten by the servants of a nobleman he'd offended with his words. He was imprisoned in the Bastille twice. Any reasonable man would have learned to be quiet. But freedom, real freedom, the kind that lives in your bones and not just in your privileges, it demands something unreasonable. It demands you keep bleeding. It demands you choose the wound over and over, even when the wound is all you have to show for your defiance. Because the alternative is a kind of death that wears the mask of life. The alternative is knowing you saw clearly and chose blindness, knowing you had a voice and chose silence, knowing you could have stood and chose to kneel. In his late 70s, weak and ill, Voltaire returned to Paris after decades of exile. The city gave him a hero's welcome. Crowds chanted his name. The theater erupted when he attended a performance. He was crowned with laurel like a Roman conqueror. And in the midst of this triumph, this vindication, his health collapsed under the strain of excitement and emotion. He died shortly after, having touched for just a moment the glory he'd sacrificed everything to earn. Some would say the wound finally killed him. Others might say he was already dying and chose to die free. But maybe the truth is simpler and stranger. Maybe the wound was what kept him alive all those years. Maybe choosing it, keeping it, letting it bleed. Maybe that was the only way he could live with himself. The only way he could look in the mirror and recognize the man looking back. You and I, we live in softer times. We're rarely asked to choose between comfort and conscience quite so starkly. But the choice is still there, smaller and quieter. Every time we see something wrong and decide whether to speak or stay silent. Every time we know a truth that would be inconvenient to voice. Every time we're offered the option to be liked or to be honest. The wound is always there, waiting to be chosen or avoided. And the question that follows us into the dark, the question that sits beside us when all the noise of the day has faded, is this. What are you willing to bleed for? What truth matters enough that you'd let it cost you something? Not everything. Heroism is rare and often foolish. But something, some small territory of yourself that you refuse to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. Voltaire knew he'd never see the revolution his words helped plant. He knew the encyclopedia he championed would be banned, its contributors persecuted. He knew the tolerance he preached would be mocked by the same people who'd later claim credit for inventing it. He knew all of this, and still he chose the wound. Because freedom without cost is just another word for comfort. And comfort, in the end, keeps no one warm when the final darkness comes. But before we leave this thought behind, there's one more silence worth listening to. 11th exploration. How does a man become dangerous by learning to laugh at himself first? The king sits on his throne, heavy with the weight of absolute certainty. The bishop stands in his cathedral, wrapped in the authority of divine appointment. The philosopher holds court in the salon, drunk on the elegance of his own arguments. And somewhere in the corner, barely noticed, a voice begins to laugh. Not the cruel laugh of mockery, not the bitter laugh of cynicism, but something stranger, something more dangerous. The laugh of a man who has seen through himself first, and having survived that sight, now looks at the world with eyes washed clean of illusion. Voltaire understood something that eludes most people their entire lives. The greatest armor against the world's weapons is to disarm yourself first. When you've already seen your own absurdities, cataloged your own contradictions, laughed at your own pretensions, what can anyone else say that you haven't already said to yourself? When you've learned to hold your beliefs lightly, to question your own certainties, to admit you might be wrong, what authority can command your automatic obedience? This is the secret that makes tyrants nervous, not the rebel with his raised fist, not the martyr with his unshakable faith, but the man who can laugh at the theater of power because he's already laughed at himself. He's dangerous precisely because he has no image to protect, no self-importance to defend. You can't shame someone who's made peace with his own ridiculousness. You can't intimidate someone who's already faced the absurdity of his own existence and found it funny. There's a story from Voltaire's time in Prussia, at the court of Frederick the Great. The king, who fancied himself an intellectual, would gather philosophers and writers for elaborate dinners filled with witty conversation. And Voltaire, sharp as ever, would entertain the court with his brilliance. But he never forgot the game being played. He never mistook proximity to power for safety. When Frederick eventually turned on him, as powerful men do when they tire of being amused, Voltaire already had one foot out the door. He'd been laughing at the whole performance from the beginning, including his own role in it. This is what separates the court jester from the true satirist. The jester makes others laugh to survive. The satirist laughs to stay free. The jester needs the king's approval. The satirist has already approved of his own foolishness, so he needs nothing from anyone else. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. One is a performance of confidence. The other is actual freedom. Think about the weight most of us carry, the weight of being right, the weight of defending our territory, our reputation, our carefully constructed sense of who we are and what we stand for. We armor ourselves in certainty. We build walls around our beliefs. We go to war over slights to our dignity, attacks on our character, challenges to our worldview. And all of this weight, all of this armor, all of these walls, they make us heavy, they make us slow, they make us easy to manipulate. Because once you've decided you must be right, you've given others a map to your vulnerabilities. They know exactly how to provoke you. They know which words will make you defensive, which accusations will make you react, which arguments will tie you in knots trying to prove yourself. Your certainty becomes your prison. Your dignity becomes your chain. But the man who's learned to laugh at himself, he's already free. When you call him a hypocrite, he agrees and asks what took you so long to notice. When you point out his contradictions, he thanks you for the reminder. When you try to trap him in his own words, he admits he was probably wrong then too, and might be wrong now, and will likely be wrong tomorrow. What can you do with someone like that? He's already done the work of dismantling himself. There's nothing left for you to attack. Voltaire wrote a novel called Candide that mocked everything, absolutely everything: philosophy, religion, optimism, pessimism, nobility, poverty, love, war, human nature itself. But most importantly, It mocked the idea that any of us, including Voltaire himself, have it all figured out. His protagonist stumbles through disaster after disaster, led by a philosopher who insists, despite all evidence, that they live in the best of all possible worlds. It's savage and funny and deeply unsettling, because it spares no one, least of all the reader who might be looking for easy answers. And here's the thing that made this so threatening. Voltaire wasn't tearing down systems from a position of knowing better. He was admitting that maybe nobody knows anything for certain, that all our grand explanations for suffering and meaning might be elaborate stories we tell ourselves to avoid facing the chaos. He was laughing at the absurdity of the human condition and inviting you to laugh with him. This kind of laughter isn't nihilism. Nihilism says nothing matters because nothing means anything. This is different. This says, nothing is sacred except freedom. And the first step to freedom is to stop taking yourself so seriously that you become a slave to your own self-image. Stop needing to be right. Stop needing to be respected. Stop needing to win every argument and defend every position. Just be human, flawed, funny, contradictory. And in that ordinariness, find something that power can never quite touch. When you're comfortable being wrong, you can't be controlled by the fear of being exposed. When you're comfortable being foolish, you can't be manipulated by your need for dignity. When you're comfortable being uncertain, you can't be trapped by demands for absolute clarity. You slip through the fingers of every system that depends on your need to be somebody important, somebody right, somebody worthy of respect. The powerful know this. They know the most dangerous person isn't the angry revolutionary. It's the person who sees through the performance and laughs at it, not with rage, but with genuine amusement. Because laughter is contagious. And once people start laughing at the emperor's clothes, at the solemnity of power, at the whole elaborate theater of authority, it's very hard to make them stop. Voltaire spent his life turning this laughter into an art form. He wrote plays and poems and histories and pamphlets, each one with a blade hidden in the joke, each one questioning some authority that claimed to be beyond question. And he got away with it longer than he should have, precisely because he never claimed to have all the answers. He was just asking uncomfortable questions, just pointing out awkward contradictions, just laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, including his own part in it. In the end, this might be the most radical act available to us, to become so comfortable with our own limitations that we stop needing the world to validate us, to laugh at ourselves so thoroughly that we're immunized against shame, to hold our beliefs lightly enough that we can change them when better evidence appears, not because we're cynical, but because we're free. And freedom, real freedom, often starts with the sound of your own laughter echoing in the dark, reminding you that you're human. And that's enough. But there's something else, something quieter, that deserves our attention before the night deepens.